And so really netnography is positioned in that area where we're looking at social media data, but we're looking at it as a manifestation of a cultural phenomenon, of real people talking about real things that really matter to them. So I developed this when I was doing my dissertation. In 1995, I was studying Star Trek fans because I thought Star Trek was a really interesting brand that had inspired all kinds of loyalty and still going strong, I might add. You know, second movie was out, and I thought it was a pretty good movie too. So that franchise is still flowing, still getting fans, still keeping people happy after a long, long time. And there was a lot of data. Fans were using the internet, they were using all of the news groups, and nobody really knew how to use this data. It really was not systematically looked at all in the field of marketing or anywhere else. So I came up with this idea of combining ethnography with what was going on the internet or networks in terms of looking at it as netnography, because it was different. The kind of cultures, the kind of communities that were going on and that were happening and that were showing themselves online were fundamentally different from the ones that were there in person. For example, everything was happening in a textual form, so everything was technologically mediated, and everything was accessible, for instance, and everything was automatically archived. So as an anthropologist, it was a beautiful thing to see everything automatically transcribed for you. Usually I would go in and study a culture and I'd have to have everything transcribed and write up field notes. No, everything's just right out there in the open. So what netnography does is it builds on anthropology and sociology and a foundation in cultural studies. It's ethnography adapted to this new reality that society has changed, technology has taken over, and there's this media society and business and so on. And it focuses on understanding this data as cultural data and using that to try and build insights that are useful for, in this case, for marketing and for marketing managers. Netnographic data, like ethnographic data, occurs out there whether we are looking for it or not. It is not elicited as, say, interview data is or survey data. It's raw. It's in a raw form. It often has a lot of bad words in it and a lot of junk, too. It is timely. Like, we can go on right now. In fact, we may do that and find data that's being created, today about your brands and your products. It's efficient because we've got access to it through browsers, and it's basically spontaneous. People are just throwing it out there. But they allow you to unpack the cultural codes behind things. So I've done quite a bit of work for a large beauty-based company, and they're really interested in women's views of beauty and how they differ, and the types of beauty that are there. And once you start to unpack that through people's communications, you get a sense of particular codes, like, that's a particular type of beauty, and we can get at that through advertising and imaging and using language around that. But it's not going to work to sell that. So for instance, skincare, for a lot of cultures, is very different from cosmetics. They're different codes, right? One's much more of a natural, wholesome beauty. The other is a more sexy beauty, a more attractive, going out and enticing kind of beauty, a more temptress beauty. So there are these images, there's these cultural codes that are shared around particular product categories, around particular events. So one of the things I say is, if you would even assign 1 hour a week, Monday afternoon between 1:30 and 2:30, to check out social media communities that are relevant to you, we would decide which ones there are. I think you would have a serious leg up over competitors who are not doing that. And I don't mean looking at the Radian 6 stuff. The Radian 6 stuff might guide you to where the conversations are happening, but I mean in there, reading the stuff as it unfolds in real time, like today, like what happened in the last week, right? Once a week for an hour, looking at stuff that happened in the last week. So here's an example from a study that I think is kind of an interesting one, also done in Germany by my colleagues at Hive. They were hired by Adidas. You mentioned Adidas before. And Adidas had this issue. I mean, Adidas, like Nike and Reebok, they're in the fashion business. So it's constant pressure to radically innovate, right? There's a constant pressure to find what's new, what's next. So their goal was to find potentially useful innovation, and this is a couple of years ago, Useful innovations from the acts and meanings social media consumers are attaching to sports shoes. They wanted to find some new innovations. What are we going to offer to people? What acts and meanings are consumers attaching to sports shoes was the question that they ended up settling on. So that was the first stage, was to come up with a question. And that one is not so easy to do. The next stage was to figure out what's going on out there. And they identified a number of different forums and different sites where people were talking about sports shoes, basketball shoes, sneakers. One of them was called Nike Talk. It had nothing to do with Nike, but it was a sneaker and shoe-oriented site. People design shoes on these sites. They share their designs. They rate shoes. They discuss shoes. It's just shoes, shoes, shoes. It's really big on shoes and sports shoes. And there are, you would not believe how many of these kind of forums and groups there are out there, dedicated to just about any lifestyle pursuit you can possibly imagine. So they focused in on 5 or 6 different sites, but Nike Talk ended up being a particularly rich site. So after identifying those, they started to follow them. And as I'm saying here, swimming in the data stream, getting to know some of the people, reading some of the stuff, establishing, okay, definitely it was a community here. People are sharing stuff. People are talking about it as a community. They're talking about injuries. They're talking about sports. They're talking about personal stuff. And they're coming up with some really interesting things that relate to what we were looking at. So they're talking about a lot of topics. Design. They're talking about a lot of ratings of shoe design, this sort of thing. And we can get at those, but we were looking for something a bit higher order. Cushioning of the shoes, the comfort of the shoes. But we focused in on things that were a bit unusual because we want something really innovative. The visual and the emotional played a major part in this. So we started looking at a lot of photographs. What was happening in the photographs? What were people showing? People were buying shoes, not just to wear them, but also to collect and display them. So these are pictures, someone put this out in front of their house, all their shoes, their shoe collection. Boxes and boxes of shoes. They're, you guys know DSW, right? Their house looks like DSW now with all the boxes of shoes there that they've got. I've got 49 pairs, soon to be 50 because my birthday's in 2 weeks. I wear all my shoes. But one of the things that they had a problem with was displaying these things, right? Like looking at them and displaying them. That's kind of ugly. Another thing that was going on was they were individualizing shoes. So they talked about modding them like you would mod a motorcycle or a car. So they strip off a layer, they paint it, they put decals on it, they spray stencils on, they recolor them, they change them around. So they focused in on these 2 themes really as kind of important. Shoe collecting and shoe individualization, and said to Adidas, okay, what can you do with that? So what they did was they developed this special edition shoe set with like a clear lucite cover and special paints and decals that you can kind of see a little bit in there, and sold it for the World Cup. So they made it a special edition, sold it for the World Cup, big premium price, high profit margins, and they actually sold out, and then they issued it again and sold out the second time. So it ended up, in terms of profitability, it ended up being one of the most profitable launches that year, and no one had anything even close to it, but people loved it. I think this is actually still a market that could be really tapped out even more. You talk about like what's new in this market, there's a lot there. It's a very interesting segment to look at. And that's a fluid movement between the online community and this very hardcore segment, and then kind of broadening out along a diffusion curve till a lot of people start to do this sort of thing. So it's an interesting example.